Good afternoon to you all. It's a great pleasure to be in Kiev, and it's a great honour to be at this university and to have the opportunity to meet you and to engage with you. And I'm grateful to the Dean and to the Head of Department for providing me with a very nice cup of coffee and for having a very good discussion before we start. I hope you'll forgive me for speaking in English, and I hope that you will provide some indication to me if I speak too quickly or if you want me to explain something more clearly. And I hope you won't mind if I sit to give my lecture. Sitting means that I can push all the buttons on this computer more easily. Because I'm tall, it's a long way down to the computer, so this makes it easier for me. I also want to say that this is a preliminary discussion, which is mainly about a number of new texts, and it's the first time I've critiqued these texts, so it's a preliminary account on this subject, and I hope that you'll take that into account if you're making notes, because it may be that next year I'll change my mind on some of these things, and it's possible that I'll change my mind because of things I learned from you in the course of the discussion. The title is intentionally provocative. I want to provide a critique of other writers and hence the notion of poverty of class analysis. I want to present my own arguments as being about class, but I differentiate myself from these other writers in not regarding it as being a class analysis in the way in which they do. So my class analysis, in inverted commas, which is a very common thing to be doing in South Africa, indicating that when we use the word race, for instance, we don't mean it as a biological category, we mean it as a social category. So my suggestion that I'm going to provide a class analysis of poverty is also somewhat exaggerated. I am concerned about the issue of unemployment, which is very high in South Africa. The level of unemployment, the rate of unemployment, is nearly 40% of the total population. But in my view, that very high level of unemployment in South Africa is useful because it gives us an indication of one of the problems of class analysis internationally, because there's unemployment everywhere. And so if we can begin to understand unemployment in class terms in South Africa, it can be useful for understanding unemployment in other countries as well. Now this provides us with an outline of the areas that I want to cover, and as you can see, the lecture will be based upon discussing a number of key writers who have made contributions to the study of class and to class analysis specifically. So I'll start with Eric Olin Wright, who was here as a fellow in Kiev, I think, just a few years ago. Last year, in fact. Okay, so I'm following up from Eric Olin Wright, and I've just given a few words just to flag something that's associated with them. I'm not going to provide an account of these words, it's just so that you know that when I say Eric Olin Wright, it triggers something. So if somebody mentions Pieter Alexander to you, you know he's a tall guy from South Africa. Eric Olin Wright is a Marxian. But there is a Weberian influence on his work. John Goldthorpe is a neo-Weberian. Mike Savage is a neo-Bourdieuvian. Jeremy Seekings is a neo-Weberian, but he's influenced by Eric Olin Wright, who is both Marxian and Weberian. And I'm presenting my own argument and that of my colleagues as being Marxist, but influenced by Eric Olin Wright. So even though I'm saying that I want to talk about the poverty of class analysis, which Wright is associated with, I'm also recognising the very valuable influences, in particular of Eric Olin Wright, but also I want to acknowledge the value of the work done by these other scholars. And I've also put on here where they come from, because the context in which people work has a big impact on their theorization. And that's not more so in this account. Wright was extending his analysis to other settings, but he's primarily concerned with understanding a situation that existed in the United States. Similarly, John Goldthorpe was based in the UK. Mike Savage is based in the UK. But Jeremy Seekings and myself are based in South Africa. So we're particularly concerned with understanding South African problems and South African dynamics. But I think we would both hope that our arguments have relevance in other countries as well. So that's the basic outline. All of these people would think of themselves as undertaking class analysis. That is an analysis of class differences and of class categories within a class structure. We're concerned with understanding class in relation to class struggle in particular. In presenting things in this manner, I don't want to suggest that Wright in particular is disinterested in class struggle, but that's not his major concern. His primary account is based upon a number of categories and developing those categories theoretically. But let's start with Wright. We're going to give 2 slides on Wright, and this first slide comes from a later essay of his, and I've used it here because it provides us with a useful understanding for subsequent discussion. He is concerned to argue that there's not a one correct way of understanding class, that there are different understandings, analyses, theorizations of class, and it's not that any one of these is wrong. So you can understand class through a stratification theory, you can understand it primarily through a reading of Weber, and you can also do it through a reading of Marx. He describes himself as a Marxian rather than a Marxist because he's primarily influenced by Marx, but not entirely so. And he argues that a Marxist understanding of class incorporates the best parts of Weber, which in turn incorporates the best accounts of stratification. And he suggests that if we're going to talk about class, the first thing is to say, if class is the answer, what is the question? What's the purpose of talking about class? And he suggests that there are a number of what he terms anchor questions, major questions that class is attempting to address. And he lists them. He says that class can be about understanding a distribution of inequality, which is the primary concern, of course, of stratification analysts. It could be about subjective location, in other words, about identity and consciousness. It could be about life chances, which is one of the key defining characteristics of a Weberian approach to class. People concerned with life chances, and this would be true of John Goldthorpe as well, want to understand how being a worker of one kind gives you more chances in life than being a worker of another kind. You're more likely to gain a degree in a university if you come from this kind of background. If you are impoverished, you're more likely to die at an earlier age, and so on and so forth. Another approach would be that class is related to antagonistic conflict, and clearly that's part of a Marxist approach, but it could also be part of a Weberian approach, either not, some Weberians. Another way of understanding class is to discern historical variation. So if you want to understand the differences between, let's say, a revolution in Russia and a revolution in Germany and one in China or Japan, one needs to understand the different configuration of classes in those different places. And then finally, we have emancipation, the central idea of a Marxist class analysis. And Wright himself says that for him, the primary anchor is emancipation. That's what he's done his research about. He wants to see a different kind of world, a more democratic world, not only democratic politically, but democratic also economically and socially. But he suggests that there can be secondary questions, secondary anchors, which are related to the first of these. And he says that his purposes, he's particularly concerned with historical variation. And this is one of the ways in which Weber influences his account, because of course Weber was interested in particular in historical sociology and understanding how class was related to social change. So that's his first and second concern. I flag this now because my argument is that we should be focused on emancipation, on changing the world. There are massive inequalities in society wherever we look. It's very unfair, it's very unjust, and that we as sociologists, in the end, are primarily concerned with changing that world. There's not much point in us studying it if there's not an implication for also changing it to create a better world. But my second, or our second, because I was working with a team of colleagues, our second concern is with subjective location. And that may seem strange because subjective location could mean different things. But we are interested in class identification or class consciousness. Because if you are going to bring about emancipation, you have to take into account the ways in which people see the world. If you're going to influence them, you have to influence them on the basis of their existing imaginations about the world. And I would suggest this comes from a Gramscian position. Gramsci, and I'll come back to it, is interested in dual consciousness, for instance. And his view is that the Democrats, the Marxists, particularly in the Italian contexts, have to be aware of the way in which workers may have an historical consciousness based upon their earlier experiences in life. And in the Italian case, they were often very backward views about the world, but they can also develop a second consciousness related to their experience of being in a workplace, the experience of having a boss, of being exploited, and of struggling against that exploitation and against the state that defends it. So our account, as you'll see, will be concerned with identity as well as with emancipation, though both of those things have to take into account class structure. Now, the reason Eric Olin Wright is famous is a consequence of work that he undertook in the 1970s. And this has been very influential, certainly in South Africa, also in a number of other countries. I heard a paper given from Brazil fairly recently, and that again was drawing on Eric Olin Wright's work. And Wright was particularly concerned in this American context of the 1970s to work out what's meant by the middle class. It seemed that this middle class was growing and growing, and it really meant different things, different kinds of things. It was in some ways amorphous, but it represented different kinds of people doing different kinds of work. And so he moves from a typical three-class model of society. I say typical, I mean typical in the West. It's not necessarily the same as that was being used in the formerly Soviet countries, state-dominated countries in China and the Soviet Union and so on. But in the West, typically, the distinctions were made between the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, that's the meaning that it certainly had acquired by the 20th century, between the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the petty bourgeoisie, a kind of middling class that stood between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the working class. And he says that there are three groupings which have a contradictory location. They stand between one of these major classes, and they can be pulled in one direction or pulled in another direction. And that the people in these contradictory class locations can have ideas which associate them with one class or another class. And the first of these are managers and supervisors. So he's interested here in the expansion of massive corporate enterprises where even the managers are not really controlling the enterprise. And even shareholders very often are not controlling the enterprise. There may be a few chief executive officers, a few presidents of major corporations that effectively are also owners or part owners of those corporations, and they direct the strategic thinking of those corporations. He would include those as part of the bourgeoisie, but they are very, very, very tiny part of the population, even for instance in the United States. Far more significant in terms of their numbers are people in the middle who are not workers, they are paid at a level which means that they are not really exploited, but they have quite a lot of control, and to varying degrees depending upon where they are in the hierarchy. And this kind of argument about managers and supervisors would exist within the state as well, and I'm sure that your experience in the Ukraine in the past, perhaps not now, is of some of the people in the middle the managers and supervisors having a great degree of control over economic activity as well as over political activity. So Eric Olin Wright sees those as being part of a contradictory class location. And then we have semi-autonomous employees who stand between the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So these would be people who have some kind of control over their own labour. They're not really part of the petty bourgeoisie, but they would be, for instance, like at least senior academics who can decide what they're going to teach and have some kind of control over their labour. This may apply also to more junior solicitors, to doctors and so on, who have some control over their labour. But they don't have complete control, they're not part of a petty bourgeoisie, they don't own something, they don't attempt to make a profit. And then we have the small employees who stand between the petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, people who are developing enterprises but no longer part of the petty bourgeoisie where they're earning an income which benefits them and their family, maybe one other person, but on the other hand they're not these heads of major corporate enterprises. So this was an argument which had a lot of currency, had a lot of value. One of the problems with it is that it didn't deal with people who weren't employed, it was occupation oriented. And the way in which Wright handled that was to talk about mediation, people who had a mediated relationship with somebody who was occupied. So this would typically include housewives. You know, if a wife wasn't employed, they would have a mediated relationship with occupation through their husband. And then there were difficulties for him. How do you deal with the unemployed? How do you deal with students? Students may no longer live with their family. The unemployed might live with somebody, they might have a mediated relationship with occupation, but they might not. And these were difficulties that he never fully resolved. I mean, he suggested in the end that part of the unemployed might constitute an underclass, separate from these class relations. They didn't have they weren't directly employed, but neither did they have a mediated relationship with people who were occupied. And I think this was a problem for his account. And I remember when he came to join us in South Africa, and we had a wonderful time with him, kind of mobile seminar going around Soweto in a minibus and stopping here and discussing it in theoretical terms, moving on and discussing the new situation in theoretical terms. And his conclusion was that the main thing that we could attempt to achieve in Soweto with our research was to better understand this problem of the unemployed, which he felt, and he was very modest about it, he hadn't adequately understood. Now, in the 1970s and 1980s, the work of Eric Olin Wright, the Marxian, was pitted against the work of John Goldthorpe, the Weberian. That's certainly the way in which he was introduced, and the way in which people captured him in shorthand terms. And he was dealing also in part with this issue of the growth of a middle class, but also with what were referred to, and in that sense, with people who were referred to as white-collar workers. No longer the traditional blue-collared worker who was employed in a factory, but the growing number of white-collared workers, technicians, people with technical skills, and the boundary between these people and affluent workers. And he did some of his research in a major car factory, where the workers were receiving quite good incomes, partly through trade union struggle, and it appeared to him were no longer really interested in class struggle. They had high incomes, and their concerns were with watching television, engaging in sport, and so on. I noted recently something which I'd forgotten about, and that's in a book by Rick Fantasia on social movements. And he says that just as Goldthorpe was publishing this book, some of the activists took leaflets into this factory, and it led to a small riot in the factory, which in itself appeared to disprove at least part of what Goldthorpe was trying to argue. But small anecdotes like that don't help us deal with the major theoretical implications of what Goldthorpe had to say, which had a major impact on Britain in particular and beyond Britain. In Britain, his work led eventually to the development of official categories for class that were used by the national state for gathering the statistics, and some of this then had an impact elsewhere in Western Europe in particular. And to begin with, he used the Weberian notion of life chances, and he was really quite successful, perhaps more successful than Eric Olin Wright, in demonstrating that one's class background had an impact on what would happen to you as an individual later in life. It had implications, for instance, on health, it had implications on education, it had implications on employment and income, housing, etc., etc., etc. But he then began to move away from that. He recognised that it was inadequate in some ways. It couldn't be defended theoretically in terms of a wider theory. And by the 1990s, by the late 1990s, he'd moved on through research and through insight and picked out two things in particular. The first thing was fairly obvious and not widely contested, and that was that one needed to make a distinction between employers and employees. But then he said that employees vary. There are different kinds of employees. And he said that on the one hand, there are people who have a labour contract. In other words, the kind of traditional worker who works perhaps on a production line, clocks in, and is paid for the amount of labour, the number of hours that they work. But there are also workers, and a growing number of workers, who have a service relationship with their employer. In other words, they're not employed for inputs, the number of hours that they input into the activities of the employer. They're not employed on the basis of being on a production line, for instance, where there is tight supervision, where there is a supervisor monitoring what you do, making sure you don't go to the toilet, for instance, or making sure your lunch break isn't extended too far, because that would mean that you aren't producing motor cars, for instance. So that there are workers, employees, who have a traditional labour contract. But there are also an increasing number of people who have a service relationship, where your work is measured in one way or another upon outputs. And in these situations, the employers can't monitor directly the work that you're doing, but they're interested in what you produce. Some of it can be producing students. This is one of the ways in which universities measure lecturers now. How many people do you teach? How many research outputs have you got? So that's a service relationship, but it would also apply to, for instance, lorry drivers. And you can think of the kinds of categories of people, in offices in particular, who are not closely monitored, and where the employer has to develop loyalty with those people in order that they produce. And some of that loyalty is to do with personal relationships, and some of that loyalty is to do with pay. Generally speaking, higher levels of pay than those people who are employed on a traditional labour contract. And that position has become increasingly influential. Again, it's led to official government distinctions, and there are 7 of these that are used in the UK. These turn out again to be rather good predictors, but there are problems with it. Again, it's occupation oriented, it's an occupation based analysis, and so it misses out certain kinds of people, students, the unemployed. While some of these are incorporated into this system on the basis, in fact, of some form of mediation, like Eric Olin Wright, there are still some people left out of it, regarded as a residual. And in some accounts, this is described as an underclass, and in some accounts, it's just a statistical residual, part of a number of people who are beyond the classes, in a sense. So I think that's a problem, and it's one we certainly want to address in our work. But Goldthorpe, especially in his early work, though there was a hangover to it into this new work, was also criticised in relation to gender, so that the class position of women was defined in terms of their relationship with their husbands. Now this is something that you can modify, and certainly Jeremy Seekings has done, and you talk instead about a dominant partner. The person with the higher status job becomes the determining individual in terms of class position, rather than necessarily the man. But there was still that problem of determining class relation in terms of another individual. And the work of Beverly Skeggs was also concerned not just with gender, but the ways in which people acted out class. So these categories might be useful in terms of pigeonholing people, putting people into a pigeonhole and say that you belong to this category or that category. But it doesn't necessarily deal with the realities. And her research was ethnographic in character. She looked in particular at a group of young women who were mostly office workers, but employed at a fairly low level. And they didn't want to say that they were working class, because working class meant something in some ways for them derogatory. They weren't like their parents, having to clock in at work in a factory. They wanted to distinguish themselves from that, even though in most class analysis they would be regarded as part of that working class. But they certainly didn't want to describe themselves as middle class either, because that implied something rather, we would say in British English, snobbish, snooty, that you look down on people like them. And so they avoided describing themselves in any kinds of class terms. So she tried to understand people like that, where specifically gender was related to class, and she did it in terms of some of the writings of Pierre Bourdieu, and in particular his writings on habitus and the ways in which people behave in a more or less ongoing way, and trying to understand that in relation to culture. Now, Mark Savage's work has led on to what's really the gold standard, if you like, of recent work on class. And it's been published in one of the top journals, Sociology, very recently. Savage has published that with a long list of other authors, co-authors, many of whom are the leading lights in sociology in the UK. And I'm quite sure that this is going to have a major impact around the world. Savage himself comes from a Marxist background, but began to be critical of that analysis associated with Marx, Marx analysis that existed at that time. And that arose from some of his work, because when he did his research in Manchester, where Engels had done his research before, he found that the people he interviewed were ambivalent, defensive, and hesitant when they were asked questions about class. Now, other people did follow-up studies, and they say that it wasn't really like that, that he'd misunderstood his own data. And we would certainly argue that people's ambivalence about class can be because it's no longer clear which class you're in. And as you'll see later, we've begun to understand that in terms of people having a dual identity. So there are ways of approaching the problems that he confronted, the empirical problems that he confronted, which wouldn't necessarily lead him to the conclusions that he's reached. The approach that he adopted was increasingly one that was also drawn from Bourdieu. But this is a different Bourdieu of Beverly Skeggs. This is a Bourdieu which is about cultural, social and economic capital rather than about habitus. And he, together with other researchers, produced a very thick book based upon extensive research, largely quantitative research, which was looking for homologies. And homologies are ways in which there is an overlap, or there might be a search for an overlap between these different kinds of capital and the positions which people operate within those actually within different fields. Is there an overlap? Is there some kind of homology? And as you'll probably recall, in France of the late 1950s, when Bourdieu was doing his work, and into the 1960s, there were these homologies. There were similarities in terms of culture and in terms of people's standing in society, especially within the elite, particularly in terms of culture. There was an educated elite that had a particular relationship to high culture, but there was also an elite which did very well economically, which did better economically, and they had a different set of relationships with culture and economics. So this is a concern to establish some kinds of relationship between, in particular at this stage, between culture, cultural and understanding of class, and an economic understanding of class. Now, in the more recent work, he and others have gone on to bring in also some understanding of social capital. And for this, they've undertaken what's called the Great Britain Class Study, GBCS for short. And what's interesting about this is that the state broadcaster, the British Broadcasting Corporation, was intimately involved in the project. And they set on an online questionnaire, and it was widely publicised on the BBC, and people could go to this online questionnaire and they could tick boxes. And something like 150,000 people contributed to the questionnaire in this way. So it was an enormous study. And even though it wasn't representative, it allowed the researchers to be able to see what was related to what. So if you were a banker, did you say that you were a worker? Did you have this much income? Did you have this kind of house and so on? And so in a similar way to Bourdieu's analysis, which also wasn't based upon a representative sample, they were able to plot some of those relationships linking social capital, economic capital, and cultural capital. But they also undertook a representative survey, not actually a very big one, about 1,000 people. But they claim that this was a representative sample of the British population, and they combined these two in developing their arguments. They measured cultural capital by doing, as they had done in this earlier study, by distinguishing between highbrow culture and low culture, popular culture. Highbrow culture meant things like going to the opera, going out to restaurants. Popular culture was things like watching television or listening to particular kinds of music, popular music. Jazz, for instance, and classical music would be regarded as high culture. So they made that distinction in terms of the responses that they got, but they took into account also the results of some of their earlier work and work by other people, which said that the elite, the upper classes, were no longer concerned with a high culture. They were omnivorous in terms of culture. In other words, they engaged in lots of cultural activity. They might go to the opera, but they would also go and watch Dynamo Kiev play against Chelsea, for instance. So they were doing lots of different things. So that was one way of measuring culture. But they were also recognised that particularly amongst younger people, they might not be involved in highbrow or popular culture of the kind that was defined as such, but they might be engaging in other cultural activities. They might be searching the web for pornography on many occasions, or for something else, but they were searching the web on many occasions, or they would be involved in Facebook activities. They would be involved in a kind of emerging culture, which was not necessarily associated with the older elite. So they had to take into account the emerging culture as well. And the social capital involved two things. One is, who do you know? So I can ask one of you, who do you know? And you can tell me who these people are in terms of their job status. And job statuses can be arranged in a hierarchy. And if you know lots of government ministers, you would have quite a high status. But if the people you know are just students, it would lower your status. And if the people you knew were unemployed, it would lower it still. So it's possible on the basis of these relationships, these networks that you have, to plot out whether you are positioning yourself in terms of status with a higher mean score or a lower mean score. But social capital was also mentioned in terms of the numbers of contacts you have. So some of us, sadly, we only have a few friends. So we would get a low score on that. But I'm sure many of you have lots of friends, you know lots of people. You're very gregarious, you know lots of people, partly because you're students, and so you would have a very high score in terms of the numbers of people that you know. And then there was the economic capital, measured in terms of household income, household savings, and house prices. Now this leads them then to distinguishing, once again, 7 classes. And I can say more about this, but time is short. But I've listed the classes that it produces an elite and established middle class, a technical middle class, new applicant workers, traditional working class, and emerging service workers, and a precariat. Now, I would suggest that there are a number of problems with this approach. The first is it's not clear what its purpose is. To go back to Ellen Roy, it seems to be just a way of categorising people in a way that's different to the other ways of categorising people, although it ends up with very similar categories to the old Goldthorpian approach. The second problem is it's not at all clear what the weighting should be. Why should you give this much weight to social capital, this much weight to economic capital, this much weight to cultural capital? And this, I think, is important because in some of the earlier British studies, and indeed in our own study on Soweto, we found that class position, if you want to call it that, determines the extent to which you regard class as being associated with culture or with economic position. So if you're relatively poor, then you tend to emphasise economic determinants of class, economic aspects of class. You would say, I am working class because I am poor or because I'm working. But if you are part of an elite, you're not really interested in those things, and you say that you are middle class because of your culture, because you have a degree, for instance. So whether people define themselves according to this class or that class depends upon culture and economic situation, but those things in turn are related to their class position. The second thing it doesn't deal with is identification. It doesn't ask people what class they belong to. And in fact, in the British case, when you do that, the majority of the population still say they're working class. And even in the US, almost as many people say they're working class as middle class. So they have almost a kind of elitist view of the way in which people themselves understand class. And at a popular level, including popular level, if you like, amongst well-educated individuals, there are still understandings of class which are usually about four classes. About a poor class, very few in terms of the British studies, about a working class, very big, a middle class, substantial, and some kind of high class or elite class or upper class, again, relatively small in the British case. And finally, it's looking at class on an individual basis. It's not concerned with households and the way in which the household you belong to can affect, for instance, your income. It does it in a generic way about households' income, but it doesn't relate it then to people's class location. So there are a number of problems with this. Now finally I want to deal with the South African situation. Because Seekings is trying to deal with a different problem. Obviously the same problems that we're trying to grapple with are those of high unemployment, and he's doing it in relation to policy alternatives in particular. He starts off with the Goldthorpian approach, which I've introduced, and he draws into the Goldthorpian approach that notion of mediation, which comes from Eric Olin Wright. But rather than looking necessarily at men as heads of household, he looks at the dominant individual. And this leads him to a pyramid model of South African society, where there's an upper class at the top, which includes some workers. Then there's a semi-professional class, an intermediate class, which includes the core working class and petty traders. And at the bottom, there's a marginal working class, people who are doing bits and pieces of work, and an underclass, who are the poorest. And what he does with that model is to show how things have changed since the end of apartheid in relation to race. So this top level is still mostly white, the middle level has been deracialised to a considerable extent, but that bottom level is still filled almost entirely by black people. So there is some value in doing that if you want to compare two periods. Historically it's useful. But there are problems with it, particularly in terms of the allocation of the unemployed. And I think he does this in a very serious manner, but he does it in relation to cultural capital. So he says that there are unemployed people who are in households where people have got jobs, and this provides them with contact with employers. They have cultural capital. They tend to be better educated if somebody in their family is employed. There's more income there, and therefore they're more likely to get a job. But if they're in a household where nobody has got a job, they themselves, he says, but there's no real empirical evidence for it, they themselves are very unlikely to get a job. And so it's that grouping, that part of the unemployed, who he regards as being a separate underclass. So then we come to our own work, which we published recently. I was poking around for this earlier, in a book which I wanted to wave at you when I put it out. Ah, here we are. Yes, this book called Class in Soweto. Now it's based upon, I don't know, 5 years or so research in Soweto. But we feel that, at least in self-critical ways, we can generalise the findings to other urban areas in South Africa, other township areas like Soweto. South Africa has these black townships on the edge of urban areas, which in the past were white and now have become areas, suburban areas, where many black people live as well. But we wanted to understand the way in which ordinary people understood class, the kind of terms that they used, and we did this using what we regard as being a Marxist approach. Now, you know, Marx in the end, in Capital, is interested in abstract categories, drawn in particular from economic relationships. But his understanding of there being a working class came from his own experience of the fact of a working class, particularly from the time he spent in Paris. But he also learned from some journalism that he did in Prussia, and from Silesia, sorry, and he also learned from the works of Engels. So he started off from the reality of there being a working class and then theorised it. And that's what we did to start with. We didn't accept the categories that Marx had handed down, like some Marxists. And we instead, we wanted to see how people themselves understood class. But not just by asking them questions, but also by seeing what people did in practice. How did they act out class? And one of the key things in South Africa is the distinction between people who are employed and engage in strike action, and very frequently so in South Africa, that on the one hand, and poorer people who are engaged in these protests that I mentioned at the beginning, who are separate in terms of their action from the employed workers. So we have to be able to explain that if our analysis is going to hold up. But for doing this kind of analysis, you have to have some kind of objective marker. And we did this by means of what we called employment categories. In other words, they weren't classes. We didn't use the word class. These are not like Goldthorpe's classes. These employment categories are really about a recognition that people have a relationship, some kind of, often indirect relationship with production on a daily basis. This is not the same as their long-term relationships with exploitation and capital. Marx really was interested in the end with emancipation, with overthrowing capitalism. And so for him and later Marxists, Lenin and so on, they were interested in those people who in some kind of ultimate way would unite more or less in the overthrow of capitalism, hence the notion of a working class. So that was linked in to day-to-day struggles, but it's not the case these days in particular, not necessarily the case in the 19th century, that people's immediate interests, and in particular the way in which they engage in protests, are the same as their long-term interests and the way in which they might be able to challenge capitalism. And this turns out to be very significant in South Africa because in terms of what people do, they're often unemployed. In other words, they're not exploited in an immediate sense, but they may mobilise as the unemployed, perhaps with others, in these big protests. So if you're interested in protests, then you need an unemployed category of people who are unemployed or underemployed, and I'll show you a graph on that in a moment. The second thing we did was to try to find out how people understand class. And as I mentioned, we did this in terms of what they say, what label do they use, and we deduced those labels from extensive qualitative research. And again, I want to show you a few graphs as quickly as I can in a moment or two. And then thirdly, this led us eventually to the conclusion that there wasn't an underclass, that the people who were unemployed were living with employed workers. They survived on the basis of that relationship for the most part. Or, another thing which is very important in South Africa, is state benefits, welfare benefits of one kind or another. And so the people who were fully unemployed and didn't get any kind of income were living with people who had some kind of income. Or there may be in situations where they were living with people who were partially employed. And this became the important category in our analysis. We discovered that there were very many people in Soweto who, although not unemployed in the sense that they never worked, and many of these people would say, what do you do? And they say, oh, we just sit at home. We haven't had any work. And if you push them sometimes, they would say, actually, we had a job the week before last. We worked, we worked, we did a job gardening for somebody. We did a job checking their stock for 2 days. We worked out a little bit in a factory because they had a rush order. So people are sometimes partially employed. In South Africa, this is referred to as doing little piece jobs. But they're not employed on an ongoing and regular basis. And then there are people who are underemployed in the sense that they can engage in some kind of petty trade. They're not petty bourgeois in the sense that they all want to become employed. That was a defining characteristic. But they may be cutting somebody's hair or selling a few cabbages, those kind of things. And what we discovered was that in terms of household income, the underemployed were poorer than the unemployed. This seemed like a surprise to us, but then we read some of the Indian literature and we realised that to be unemployed, you have to be in a household where somebody's got a job, with some other income coming in. Otherwise, you have to scratch a living by being a partial worker or being involved in subsistence activity of one kind or another. Now, the underclass argument also breaks down in terms of people's life cycles. So you might, in fact, be a student and then become unemployed, and then you become a partial worker, and then you have a little bit of income, enough to buy a pair of scissors or enough to buy some packets of cigarettes which you sell, and so you become a subsistence, you become involved in subsistence trading, subsistence activity. And then eventually, when you're a bit more responsible and respectable and you've made a number of contacts, you might get a job as a worker, and usually, certainly in South Africa, or commonly in South Africa, people who are doing manual work are retrenched somewhere later in their years before they get to pensionable age, and so they might become unemployed again. So there's a life cycle which links these different categories and which suggests that there isn't really an underclass. People are moving on in the life cycle. And they're also living in neighbourhoods in South Africa, living in neighbourhoods which are very mixed. And then we also wanted to relate all this to our rebellion of the poor argument, and there we discovered this distinction between the poor and workers, which I began to understand in terms of relationships to the means of protest. In other words, these are not class differences between the poor and the working class. They're differences in terms of the ways in which people protest. Now, I'm wondering what I should do next, whether I should explain some of our findings or whether I should pause there for some questions, and then maybe, if we have time, go on to some of the findings, which of course I think are very interesting. So I'm in your hands.
Maybe we shall proceed to the findings.
Yeah, the findings is...
Okay, I'll do them as quickly as possible. Okay, so this is the pie chart showing the employment categories in Soweto. And there is a tiny little strip there, but only 0.1%, less than 0.1% of people who in Soweto could be regarded as capitalists. And we're very modest in our criteria. You know, if you employ more than 10 people, you'd be a capitalist in terms of these categories. Now, I should say that we did look at Soweto in relation to the rest of South Africa, and we discovered that the rate of unemployment was actually higher in Soweto than it is for other black people. These are all black people in Soweto. But the amount of things that people had was slightly greater. People weren't quite as poor in Soweto as elsewhere. And I think this is partly because people are moving into Soweto in the hope that they will get a job in Johannesburg, the city it's part of, which is the biggest city in South Africa, the richest city in South Africa, the city with the biggest economy in the whole of Africa. And so they move in, but there's a lot of unemployment when they look for jobs. But when they settle down, particularly if they're older, they begin to accrue quite a lot of possessions, refrigerators, sometimes cars, and so on. So they were very small in number. The managers also are really quite a thin slice of the population. And here again, we were very liberal in terms of who we put in as managers. It included supervisors, for instance, in supermarkets, who were supervising maybe 5 people. We guided them together with the managers. Regularly employed workers, the next category. You probably can't see these things. These are the capitalists, the managers, regularly employed workers. Only a quarter of the total population in Soweto. In some ways, South Africa is a very working class country, but in fact the number of regularly employed workers is small. Here are our partial workers, about 10-11% of the population. Here the survival is self-employed, another 10-11%. And here are the underemployed, again about a quarter. So about a quarter here, about a quarter here, and a quarter in the underemployed. So just over a quarter for the rest of the population. And the rest of the population includes the petty bourgeoisie, shopkeepers typically, people who may have family members working in their shop, 1-2 people, but they're not people who are accumulating capital like the capitalists. They are about, as I remember, about 10% of, so it must be less than that, about 8% of the population. Students are a very big number in Soweto, but we were looking at people over the age of 16, so most of these students were in fact students who are still at school. And then the final segment are pensioners and other people not in the labour force. So that's how the population of Soweto divides up. So it's useful that you've got that so that you can imagine what Soweto looks like in social terms. These are the employment categories. And this is just to show you how this relates to the South African population as a whole. These are statistics South Africa data. And here you see formal employment. These are the employed workers. So South Africa as a whole, 27.4%. So Soweto isn't very different from the rest of South Africa. The unemployed here as a total of the population, not so different from what we found in Soweto. 20.9%, we had 25% in Soweto. Those in formal employment in South Africa, plus domestic workers and so on, comes to about 13% of the total. But we have this massive segment here in South Africa of people who are non-economically active. Now we're excluding from this the so-called discouraged work seekers who are not regarded as unemployed in ILO categories, and we included them as part of the unemployed. So this doesn't include discouraged work seekers. This is massive in South Africa. It includes lots of students, so-called housewives, and various other categories. Nearly 40% of the population. So what we end up with is only 40% of the population of South Africa involved in doing work of some kind. And some of these people are just nominally working because they're doing 1 hour work in the previous week. So this is slightly different from what we got in Soweto because it's taking into account rural areas where a high proportion of people are not economically active, and it's taking into account poorer townships than the one we have in South Africa. But this is the overall picture for the whole of South Africa. And then we asked people how they would label themselves in class terms. And this is what we found. Now what's unique about our study, one of the ways in which we feel we've made a contribution, is that people weren't asked, are you part of the middle class, are you part of the working class, etc., etc. We allow people to have more than one class identity. And I think this was important because people in practice do have contradictory ideas. I don't know how it works in the Ukraine, but certainly in the UK, for instance, people can say that they are working class because they are working, they're employed, but they're middle class in terms of how they see themselves related to consumption and to other people. And this happens, as you'll see, in South Africa as well. So when you do things in this way, you find a large number of people who say they're middle class. Now we were shocked by this. I mean, Soweto is a poor area, but 66% of the population of Soweto, this is a large random survey, 2,500, 2/3 of them say that they're middle class. The next highest are the working class, and then the second class. It turned out that the second class is really very similar to the middle class, and in the next table you'll see that we've merged them, and then the poor, 39%, which turns out to be very similar to the lower class and the third class. and the rich people. These are categories that people themselves use in qualitative research. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this when we pursued it is that a lot of people are saying they're middle class because they're translating from one of the local languages, non-English languages in other words. So they may be Zulu speakers, they may be Xhosa speakers or Sotho speakers, and in those languages there are terms which when they're translated from the Zulu, for instance, Pakati, they get translated into middle class. But it's not really a word that means middle class, it means that they are in the middle, that they are middling. And it can have been in the past that they are middling in terms of where they live, between the river and the mountain. Or it can be that they are middling in the sense that they are part of the chiefs, that they are elders, and they sit in the middle of this kraal, and this normally be used for keeping cattle, and participate in discussions. These are some of the associations that existed. But it gets translated in an urban context to being middle class. People are neither rich nor poor, and that was something that people use very often when they wanted to define the middle class. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but this is what happens when you link up these different class labels. 21% of the population just said that they were middle class and nothing else. But the second most popular category is people saying that they're lower class, i.e. poor, and middle class. So that's possible as well. You can say that you're poor in terms of not having very much, but you're also middling, you're not as poor as other people, and we found that on a number of occasions. Or you can just be lower class, i.e. poor, or you can be working class and middle class. So that was quite common. So that's what happens when you look at the dual identities. And now this is going to be the last slide I show you. This is the associations you get then with the four main classes. If you ask people how many classes are there, typically they will say 3 classes. Some will say 2, some will say 3, but in fact what you find, and you can see it in the previous tables, is that people are able to distinguish 4 different classes. There's the upper, middle and lower, but there's also the working class. And the associations with lower class were in terms of the view of the word lower class, it meant people who were deprived or not coping very well. It was a slightly derogatory term. So the lower class are those people who can't afford. And this word afford was used very widely. And it gets translated from English into Zulu and Sotho as ifodi or afodi. There were older terms that were used, but it's the English word that is used widely in Soweto. So the people who are poor are people who can't afford. And then you could debate what it is they can't afford. But the point about this is that there is a link between economic well-being and in the end with occupation and class, between that on the one hand and the cultural aspects of class. It's to do with affording. What are the things that you can afford? So the lower class are people who were deprived in material terms, who were not coping because they would have to borrow things. They were struggling, that's the other word. People would say we are struggling to survive, therefore we are poor, and there was a relationship between the two. And in terms of those people who said that they were poor, they were deprived in material terms, they were struggling, and they were lacking many things. Not usually food in the South African context, but they lacked other kinds of possessions which they wanted. And then in the survey, in other words, the quantitative data, what we found is that they were deprived of a range of different services, of durables, refrigerators, proper stoves, being able to use electricity and so on. And they tended to have lower levels of education as well. So there is a clear relationship between the label of lower class and the people who were more deprived. And then we come to upper class, not many of those in Soweto, so it's difficult to know what upper class really means. But it was often defined in terms of what people said as those who have everything. You know, if you have lots of different things, if you go into somebody's house and they have pictures on the wall, they have a flat screen television, they have 1 or 2 cars, and they can afford to go to restaurants, then they had everything, and they would be described as being upper class. So again, there is an association between that particular label and something material. And then I want to jump to the bottom. There were the people who described themselves as working class. Now these are people who are doing steady work. They might be employed, they might actually be petit bourgeois, they might be part of that managerial class that we saw. And overwhelmingly, people who are regularly working describe themselves as working class. The partial workers didn't usually, they would be regarded as poor. So the working class was associated in Soweto. I think it's more widely true in South Africa, and it seems to me, from what I've seen of British data, it's true in Britain as well. You know, you find bankers who are quite wealthy describing themselves as working class because they are working. So there's a conflation then of work and working class that exists in the popular imagination, which is somehow different from the way in which it was understood in the 19th century and thus understood in Marxist terms. And then we have this massive grouping, the middle class, and it's ubiquitous. It wasn't associated with anything really. So everybody wants to be middle class. It doesn't mean anything. So I've subsequently come to the conclusion that when people say, is the middle class growing in South Africa? You know, you do these interviews for the BBC or somebody else, the BBC in particular, love to say that the middle class is growing. It's growing in India, I've seen a program on that. It's growing in Latin America, I've seen a program on that. It's growing in the Middle East, I've seen a program on that. It's growing in Africa. You know, wonderful technical production. We're now going live to Nigeria. Now we're back in Johannesburg. And now we're going to Kenya or something like that. One of those programs that zaps all over the world. And they have an agenda. They want to show that the middle class is growing. It shows that in some way or other capitalism is successful. And a number of us on the program said, look, it doesn't actually mean anything, this term middle class. You know, it can mean one thing to you as somebody who's wealthy and coming from Britain, but it means something else altogether if you live in Soweto. So I think that the notion of middle class is unhelpful. So this is some of the data that we've come up with from our survey in Soweto, and it leads us, together with other research on the rebellion of the poor, to conclude that, that there are these distinctions that should be made between the poor and workers, but in the end they belong to a similar class, they have similar class interests, and those class interests are ones which would allow us to confirm the basics of Marx's account, which recognises that there are employed workers, but there was also a relative surplus population, most of whom are part of a reserve army of labour. And that, in overall terms, is the picture that we can present for South Africa. Obviously, the details are different, and the ways in which we got to that conclusion are different as well. So my argument then, I think, you can challenge it, is basically a Marxist position.
I think we have time for a few questions. Sure.
Okay, Mr. Alexander, I have got a question. How do you rate the possibility of working class in Soweto in protest potential? Are there any trade unions which are helping people to know their rights, or people just work and they just in fear to lose their job?
Shall we maybe collect like 2 or 3 and then allow Peter to answer them together? Are there any more questions or comments? Or let Peter
Maybe
answer?
I would like, you just started with the slide with the question of Eric Wright. For what question class structure and class can give the answer for us? So what do you think this type of classification, and what is your idea? What question, research question, can help to find answer the class structure? And do you think that in South Africa is the same question as in Europe, or it's always different? The structure is closely related with the society, with the specificity of society. What do you think?
You implied that one of the main points that working class from this lower class, the poor, is the methods of the protest, yes? So I'd like to hear more on this distinction and also on this notion of middle class. Can we regard it as a false class consciousness that is reproduced by the dominant ideology?
By BBC.
By BBC.
Good questions again.
Yes.
Do take into account field of work in classification, especially in connection of working class, rural employment or industry employment or etc. Do you take into account the field of work?
So I'm not quite getting the question. Can you just reformulate it for me?
The sphere where the workers are employed, like if they're employed in agriculture,
Oh, I
in
see.
industry, in services.
Yes, and may I add to this question, does it mean if they work in official or informal economy to this class differentiation? Or the self-identification with class for the...
Should I just try and respond to these because there's already a lot of them now. The first question, or with the first question, I need to explain something about the spatial configuration of South African society. During the 20th century in particular, and more so after the coming of apartheid in 1948, black people were moved out of the main city areas into separate, what were then called locations, what were called afterwards townships. And since then, as the apartheid was coming to an end, and people remained in the urban areas when they weren't supposed to be there legally, many of them, because there was so much pressure on formal housing, began to establish informal settlements. And these informal settlements consisted of shacks rather than proper brick-built houses like the townships. So today there was a bit of a distinction between the townships, the informal settlements, and where the better off people live, which is in the suburbs of the main city or the main town in a particular area. So there's that separation between the suburbs, the big physical separation, particularly in Johannesburg, between the northern and southern suburbs, where the better off people live, and the townships and informal settlements where poorer people live. Quite a lot of teachers would move out of the townships now. People who begin to get better paid typically move out of the townships and into the suburbs. So there's that migration going on. And one of the criticisms of our survey is we didn't capture that migration. Now the industry was located in the middle, between where the workers are and where the better off people, the middle classes, are. Because the managers and the workers came from the white areas to work in the industry, and they also required the workers who were black to come to the industry. Now, this matters in terms of the question because it has an influence on the distinction between workers' strikes associated with workplaces and the protests which are associated with the townships and the informal settlements. And so it means that when we talk about struggles in the townships, we're not really talking about struggles of workers in terms of strikes and so on. We're talking about struggles of mainly the poor. And so there are certainly, it's not just a question of potential to protest in Soweto. There is lots of protest that goes on in Soweto, particularly in the informal settlements around Soweto, but also in Soweto itself. Maybe electricity gets cut off and people then protest and they burn down the house of the councillor. They use the councillor as a target. So that's the question of protests. The issue of what is the question? Well, as I say, for me, the main question is about emancipation. How do we create a new society? A society without exploitation, a society which is much more democratic than the one in which we have at the moment, a society based upon social equality rather than oppression of people based upon gender or sexual orientation or nationality or ethnicity and so on. So you know what Marx himself, Lenin as well, would have regarded as being a socialist society. So that's what I would see as being a goal of an understanding about class. How do you transform the world? And that's one of the ways in which I think my position is a Marxist position. That's really what Marx was concerned with. It's what Eric Wright says he's concerned with, although often he's really stepping back from that quite a long way when he understands class analysis. So that's my main question. Now other people can have other questions. So I can't say that mine is the right question, but it's the question which I prefer to be asking. You might want to ask a question about social differentiation, about stratification. And if you did that, the approach you would take to methodology would be a different approach to methodology. So methodology is related to theory, and theory itself is related to, if you like, your politics, your ideological position. And I'm certainly opposed to any kind of sociology which wants to enforce a particular methodology, because methodologies themselves have political implications and theoretical implications, and we need to justify our methodology in terms of theory and in terms, I think, of politics as well. So the issue of the means of protest, well, what I'm trying to convey here is that, as I've argued, I think workers and what I've called the poor here, the poor isn't measured in terms of income, household income, income from employment, and so on. It's not really about income. It's a social definition. It's a social definition which includes the unemployed and the underemployed, most pensioners, most students, and so on. Doesn't include the employed, doesn't include the petty bourgeoisie. And so the poor is a social definition of people, but it's not a class. My argument is that workers and the poor are part of a working class. They have long-term class interests in common. That doesn't mean that in the short term they have the same interests. So that in some of these protests that I've mentioned, the youth, the unemployed, might be very definite that workers shouldn't go to work. They might set up barricades. They might threaten to attack workers if they go to work. And this relates to a history of that kind of activity in the 1980s in particular. So workers can say, I'm not with these people. I need to go to work because I have to get my wage. These people don't understand that it's my wage that keeps them going. I don't want to lose my job. I've got to go to work. And I looked at one protest in detail, and on the first day, most of the workers didn't go to work. And I got the reports of that from the industrial relations experts in all of the major workplaces. They all said the same thing. On the second day, people are beginning to drift back to work. They don't go on the main route to their workplace because they can't get the taxis, people are stopping them from walking there and so on. They find some kind of circuit, a long way round, and eventually they get to work. But then the employers say, yeah, but they weren't really concentrating on their work. Now, maybe they weren't concentrating on the work because they did actually identify with the protest, or it maybe just took them too long to get there. The third day, most people get back to work. So there can be some kind of force that's used, some kind of threat of violence that's used, but as in the struggles of the 1980s, if most people are opposed to that, then it begins to become impossible for the youth to operate on that basis. Strikes, when they happen, involve workers, they don't involve the youth. The workers vote over pay, typically, whereas the youth are involved in protests about service delivery. That's what they can mobilise around. Getting electricity for their settlement, getting proper sanitation so the shit doesn't go down the street. Those are the kind of things that people can protest about if they are unemployed. But they're not, as you can see, the things that workers will protest about. Workers can develop formal organisations in trade unions. You don't get trade unions amongst the unemployed. They instead have temporary protests, which are often quite violent and often quite quickly organised. The workers' protests often take quite a long time. goes through long procedures. You've got to do things properly. You have to inform the employer. Then you've got to go through the state. 30 days notice before you can have a strike, and then afterwards you'll take a few days after that. People will protest quickly. They don't want the police to know. You know, they're going to be secretive about it. It's not going to be a formal procedure. And I could go on and indicate other ways in which there are differences. But I would argue that when workers win a pay increase, it's a benefit not only to their families, but also to the people who live around them, who can then borrow some money, who can persuade a worker to buy them a small beer or some cigarettes. If there's more money coming into a township, it means some minor expansion in the economy locally. And if the poor win on service delivery issues, they get electricity, it's a benefit to everybody in the township. So you can see that the ways in which people protest are of benefit to the poor and to the workers, similarly. The question of the middle class, is it false consciousness? I don't know, I've never quite thought about it in those terms, partly because I'm uncomfortable about the notion of false consciousness, which in fact is not something which Marx talks about. It's something which is ascribed to Marx, but it doesn't really fit his account. But false consciousness would suggest that there is something which is the middle class, materially, and what I'm saying is I don't think that exists even. So you would have to demonstrate to me that there is something called the middle class for us to demonstrate that people who describe themselves as middle class and aren't this thing that you're calling the middle class, that is the relationship. And what I'm saying, I think, is that the middle class doesn't really exist unless you tell me what it is. So if the BBC tell me what they mean by the middle class, I'll tell them whether it's growing or not. I'll find the data to answer their question. But if they want an answer to the question of whether the middle class is growing, I can't give an answer to it. I don't know what they're talking about. So you've got to define the middle class. I don't mind if the BBC define the middle class. What I mind is when they don't define it. Then it becomes ideological. Because then it's something that most people want to belong to. They want to be normal. Normal is associated with being middle class. So if you say that the middle class is growing, it's something everybody feels warm about, comfortable about. You know, this is us. We're growing in numbers. It's our kind of people that are beginning to dominate in society. Now, if you want to call that a form of false consciousness, then so be it, and I would agree with you. I'm not saying that middle class doesn't exist. I'm saying that it exists only if you define what that middle class is. The question of spheres of operation. I think that this probably is true to some degree. I mean, I want to talk about South Africa. It may be different in different countries. There are rural areas in South Africa which we haven't investigated. Those rural areas vary in character. Some of them are quite deep rural areas where people are engaged in agricultural production and usually quite poor. But there are other things which are called rural areas which were just dumping grounds for apartheid. People were moved out of certain areas and just dumped there, you know, in the rural area. Nothing they could do, no rural production, very little income from the state, and enormous poverty, terrible services and so on. Very low levels of employment. And so the form of life in the rural area isn't just one thing, it's more than one thing. You know, if we did the research using our terms, we would find higher unemployment and higher underemployment than we do in an area like Soweto. So the kind of relationships of class, the configurations of class, would be different in rural areas than they are in major cities like Johannesburg. But even in Johannesburg, you know, there are differences between workers. You know, a domestic worker, for instance, who lives at the house of their boss, is going to be quite different to the employed worker who is employed in Johannesburg. And that has an impact in terms of their income, in terms of their potential to mobilise collectively, and so on. I mean, we can discuss some details later. Officially employed, informally unemployed, yeah, there are differences, but I wouldn't make too much of them. I think the notion of informal employment is very nationally specific. The definition of it in South Africa is very different to the definition of it in India, for instance. So again, we have to be careful in terms of using these terms as analytical categories. We need to be quite specific about what we're talking about. The category is there in terms of state statistics, and I didn't unpack those state statistics. Instead, I was using it informal employment almost as an analogy for people who are underemployed, and that is probably inaccurate. Some of the people who are regarded as informally employed by the state, it turns out actually employ a lot of people. I mean, one of our field workers in the Soweto research, one of our students, said his father was he was in the informal sector, but he employed 100 workers. You know, it's just that he was avoiding taxation. He wanted to become formalised, and he was looking for a way of doing that without being put on criminal charges for what he was doing in the past. And there are interesting distinctions in South Africa between the informal sector and being informally employed, and it depends upon how many people you're working with and so on. So the informal sector really means you're not paying taxes. Informal employment means you're being employed by somebody in the informal sector, putting it simply. Now, different definitions are used in other countries, and to me the question is, are you employed or not? That would be the main thing. It's a socio-economic relationship which is more important than a legal definition.
I think we don't have any time left. So
There was one question there which we kind of promised to answer.
yeah. Is there?
In the middle, sorry.
I was interested in whether you examined the, returning to the pie chart with employment categories, whether you examined it in the context of race and gender, and what kinds of distinctions lie there inside those categories.
We didn't do it in terms of race, and that's because almost the entire population was black. I mean, there's a notion of coloured in South Africa, which sometimes gets defined as mixed race, but it's much more complicated than that. And about less than 1% of the population was coloured. People talk about the whites in Soweto, but they're like about 10 people in a population of something like 1.5 million, so they're almost non-existent. But in the interviews we did, people were concerned about race. But if you're black, your main concerns are about other black people. The whites are so far away socially that it doesn't affect you very much. It might affect you a bit ideologically, and you may be aware of the whites being better off, but it wasn't something that came into the research in a significant way. Gender was something we had to look at, because we had to worry about whether women and men were responding differently to our questions. And they did on some questions, and where that's occurred, we reported on it in the book. But generally speaking, it's not significant.
So we have to end now, I think. So let us thank Peter once again, and we're looking forward to your visit in May and more lectures in May.